Hi everybody, welcome to this session. I think some people are just joining up now, so I'll just welcome you while other people are joining. So yes, it's great that you could be here to share this session on transformation through adversity. And let me introduce myself first of all. I am Dr. Steve Taylor. I'm a lecturer in psychology, lecturer and researcher in psychology at Leeds Beckett University. And I'm also the current chair of the Transpersonal Psychology Section of the BPS. And I'm doing this, this workshop session on behalf of the Transpersonal Section. And I think most of you who join the session are members of the Transpersonal Section. So I think most people have joined now, so I'll begin with the session. So I'm hoping that it's going to be an interactive session to some degree. I'm going to share some of my research into the phenomenon of transformation through adversity. I've been researching this topic for probably about 13 years now. In fact, when I did my master's degree at Liverpool John Moores University 13 years ago, I did my thesis on this topic. Then I went on to study it in my PhD. And for the last 10 years or so since my PhD, I've been doing further research on this topic. And I'll share some of that research with you today. And I want you to reflect on your own experiences in relation to the topic as well. And later, towards the end of the session, we'll have a kind of an exercise, kind of meditative, contemplative exercise to examine your own experiences in relation to this topic. And there'll also be time for questions towards the end of the session. But if you want to type in your questions as we go along, that's fine too. You can just type in your questions as we go along. And maybe I'll respond to them at the time, but probably most likely I'll respond to them at the end. So let's just briefly summarize the content of today's session. So first of all, we're going to look into my research into awakening experiences and the connection between awakening experiences and psychological turmoil. Awakening experiences are basically higher states of consciousness. I wrote an article about them, about awakening experiences in the BPS Journal in The Psychologist last year, I think it was. So maybe you read that article. And then we're going to look into the phenomenon, or the phenomena of post-traumatic growth and post-traumatic transformation. And I'll explain more about those in a short while. And we're going to look into the question of why there is a strong connection between psychological turmoil or adversity and transformation. Why does psychological turmoil seem to have a powerful transformational effect? Why do people who are going through great adversity and challenges in their life, why do they sometimes undergo growth on the one hand, but also possibly transformation? And we're going to look into the qualities that are necessary to harness the transformational potential of adversity, which are acknowledgement, openness, and acceptance. Because obviously all human beings go through adversity as part of what human life is all about. We go through difficulties, challenges, suffering, crises, and so on. You know, as the Buddha said, life involves suffering. But, you know, why do some people grow or maybe undergo transformation in response to suffering, whereas other people don't? So what are the qualities we need to cultivate in order to harness the transformational aspects of adversity? And then we're going to move on towards the end to the exercise, which I call the alchemy of acceptance. And hopefully, as I say, we'll get the chance to look into some of your own experiences as well. So let's begin by looking into what I call awakening experiences. These are temporary experiences. And I will begin by asking you a question. And this is actually a question which I have often used in my research. And the question is, have you ever had an awakening experience that is a temporary expansion and intensification of awareness? This could be an experience in which your surroundings have become intensely real, when you felt a sense of connection to them and a deep sense of well-being inside. Or perhaps you have felt a sense that all things are one and you are part of this oneness. So yeah, just think for a moment about whether you've had that type of experience. These experiences are sometimes called spiritual experiences, but I prefer to call them awakening experiences because they often occur in the midst of everyday life, outside the context of spiritual practices or spiritual traditions. And I also find that the word spiritual is such a tricky word. A lot of people misunderstand, or they have a different interpretation of the word spiritual. It's quite a kind of a tricky word to define. So I find that the term awakening experiences has a more specific meaning. So these experiences, they're not uncommon, but they're not particularly common. I think research shows that research shows that around half of people, 50% of people, have had this experience at least once in their lives. And I've been researching these experiences for about 10 years now. And I'll give you one typical example of an awakening experience. This is quite an intense one. Awakening experiences have different levels of intensity. And this is quite an intense one. And it was actually, I won't tell you the context yet because it will make more sense in a short while. We'll just read the experience itself now. It was a young woman, who suddenly had this experience out of the blue for no apparent reason that she was aware of. And she said, "I saw reality as simply this perfect oneness. I felt suddenly removed from everything that was personal. Everything seemed just right. All my problems suddenly seemed meaningless, ridiculous, simply a misunderstanding of my true nature and everything around me. There was a feeling of acceptance and oneness. It was a moment of enlightenment. The euphoria and inexplicable rush of knowledge and understanding following this episode lasted for days." So as I say, this is a fairly intense awakening experience. Most of these experiences feature a sense of connection or even oneness in its intense form. This is a sense of oneness, as in this experience here. But usually there's a sense that we are no longer separate individuals. We are no longer separate from our surroundings, from other people, from the world in general. In some sense, we connect with nature, with other people, or with the whole world. We participate rather than being detached observers of our experience. And as in this experience, there's often a sense of meaning, a sense of powerful positivity, a sense that life does have a kind of meaning. And there's a sense of being lifted beyond our normal problems. As she said, the problems suddenly seem meaningless, ridiculous. And as I say, these experiences, by definition, they're temporary. So sometimes they last for a few seconds, a few minutes, maybe a few hours, sometimes maybe a couple of days or so. But they usually fade away, and there's a sense that people return to their normal state. This expansive awareness, this very intense awareness, fades away, and people return to a more limited state. But usually people don't feel bereft. They feel that, these experiences usually leave them with a sense of optimism, a sense that life is more meaningful and that they can trust life. There's also a sense that there is more to the world than they were previously aware of. But one of the things I've been particularly interested in my research is trying to identify the contexts or situations in which these experiences arise. I mean, Abraham Maslow, he meant something similar to these experiences when he talked about peak experiences. They're very similar. But Maslow said that peak experiences are usually accidental and spontaneous, and there's nothing you can do to predict them or bring them on. But I found in my research that these experiences are related to particular activities, particular situations, and particular states of mind. So these are some of the activities and situations which can trigger awakening experiences. One of them is contact with nature, walking in the countryside, swimming in a lake, even running as well. Running can be a trigger of spiritual experiences or awakening experiences. Spiritual practice like meditation, yoga, prayer, watching or listening to an arts performance. Psychological turmoil, such as stress or depression. Reading spiritual literature. In my research, funnily enough, it could be obviously connected to the kind of people who I'm in contact with or who make contact with me. But I found that there seem to be particular books which have a certain power about them to bring about awakening experiences. Quite a few people have written to me saying that they've had awakening experiences while reading books like The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle, for example. And also ingesting psychedelic substances. I'm not going to ask you if you've had any of those type of awakening experiences, but as long as you don't ask me, then I won't ask you. But yeah, there's obviously a link between awakening experiences and psychedelic substances. We're talking about ayahuasca, LSD, magic mushrooms, and so on. It's well known since the advent of psychedelics in the 1950s and 1960s, and even before then, particularly amongst indigenous peoples, it's been well known that certain substances have the capacity of expanding and intensifying our normal awareness, and therefore bringing about an awakening experience. So what I want you to do for a moment is to think about these 6 triggers that I've written down and decide maybe the 1 or 2 triggers which you think are the most significant ones amongst the general population. If we asked 1,000 people who've had awakening experiences, what were the triggers of those experiences? What do you think would come up as the 1 or 2 most significant triggers? And you can type your answer in the chat box if you can get access to it. So Zoe says psychological turmoil, psychedelics and nature. Hara says art and turmoil. I like that term, actually. That'd be a good title for a book, Art and Turmoil. Nature, spiritual practice and reading. Performing an arts performance. That's an interesting one. Yeah, that is also sometimes a trigger of awakening experiences. Interestingly, a while ago, I read the autobiography of Ravi Shankar, the Indian musician, and he talked quite a few times in the book about powerful mystical experiences he'd had while playing music. So yeah, a lot of people have said nature, awakening experiences similar to enlightenment. Well, we'll come to that in a moment. Yeah, they are similar. We'll come to that in a moment. Turmoil practice, Mike Rush says nature in that order. That's quite a good guess. Yeah, so a lot of people have mentioned nature. A lot of people have mentioned psychological turmoil. And you're all pretty close. I'll show you what my research has shown in the next slide. So my research has shown that the most significant trigger of awakening experiences is psychological turmoil. That's stress, depression, loss, bereavement, combat. So in a survey I did with my co-researcher, Christina Agato-Svabo, 3 years ago now, we found that of 90 awakening experiences, some of which had more than 1 trigger, over a third of them, 37 of them, were related to psychological turmoil. They occurred in a situation of psychological turmoil. And there was a whole, wide variety of different forms of turmoil, including, as I say, combat. We had a few awakening experiences that were given us by ex-soldiers that seemed to be connected to the intense stress of being on a battlefield, and also the encounter with death. If you're on a battlefield, you're face to face with death, and that can be a trigger of awakening experiences. And there were three other significant triggers. The second one was nature, contact with nature. And, you'd expect that nature is a powerful trigger of awakening experiences. We only need to look back to the romantic poets like William Wordsworth, whose poetry is full of descriptions of powerful awakening experiences in the natural world. And then spiritual practice was also a pretty significant trigger. And spiritual literature was also a significant trigger. So I guess if you put spiritual practice and spiritual literature together as one trigger, then they would almost be as significant as psychological turmoil. So anyway, there were a few other less significant triggers like love, watching or listening to an arts performance, but that only came up 3 times. Psychedelics only came up 3 times. But again, that probably reflects the sample that we had in our research. And also, I think amongst the general population, not too many people have actually taken psychedelics. Obviously, amongst transpersonal psychologists, there's a higher figure than in the general population. But I think, not so many people in the general population have taken psychedelics, which is probably why it's not come up as such a significant trigger. Whereas in contrast, almost everybody has gone through psychological turmoil at some point in their lives. So, by the way, there were 1 or 2 other significant triggers. Sexual encounters were also, there were some reports of those experiences, just only 2 or 3, I think. But again, people are probably, reluctant to divulge intimate experiences. So, in reality, a trigger such as sexual experiences is probably higher than it's shown in my research. But there is there is some literature showing that there is a connection between sex and awakening experiences. You could look into the researches of the transpersonal psychologist Jenny Wade, for example. She's done a lot of research in the area. So let me just give a couple of examples of powerful awakening experiences caused by psychological turmoil. And this is one of the experiences which was given me by an ex-soldier. This was a guy who was in the Vietnam War in America. This was in 1969. He had this experience. And he was in the middle of a battle in Vietnam in 1969. And he had this experience. With casualties mounting, I was in a state of high anxiety, and I figured there was no way I would live through the seemingly endless battle. At one point, after carrying yet another severely wounded Marine to a waiting chopper, something happened to me. It is actually indescribable, but I will make a feeble attempt to do so. I opened up literally from my perspective. I came out of myself. I expanded infinitely. I disappeared. It didn't last long, but it was the most powerful experience I've ever had. So this is also a fairly intense awakening experience. Again, it features this sense of expansion, a sense of becoming one with our surroundings or with the whole universe. And this gentleman, when he returned to America after the war, he sensed that he didn't know anything about spirituality, but he sensed that there was something spiritual about the experience. So when he heard about things like meditation and Buddhism, he sensed that he could find out more about his experience in those traditions and practices. So he began to meditate. He learned about Buddhism, and he realized eventually that he was trying to recapture this experience. And he told me that he'd never managed to recapture it. Unfortunately, he'd had glimpses, but he'd never managed to recapture this incredibly intense experience. But he said that nevertheless, the experience had given him, a powerful insight into reality, and it had changed his life. It had set him on a more meaningful path in his life. Just to go back to the other experience I gave you earlier, this was also an experience in the midst of intense psychological turmoil. This was actually a young woman who was suffering from intense depression. She had attempted suicide, and she had this experience while she was in hospital, recovering from her suicide attempt. She just woke up one morning, and for some reason there was a marble on her bedside table in the hospital. And she picked up this marble, and somehow it became a symbol of the oneness of the universe, and she suddenly shifted into this awakening experience. And because the experience had a powerful after effect, she began to recover from her depression and began to develop a more positive outlook. So that's a good example of the after effects of awakening experiences. But now I want to move on to more permanent experiences. I've said that awakening experiences are temporary. So I want to move on to more stable and permanent experiences rather than temporary experiences. I want you to consider this question. And again, you can offer some answers to this question in the chat box. So this is the question I'm going to ask you. Have you ever had a bad experience involving stress, upset, suffering, and turmoil, which you feel that in the end had a beneficial effect, making you feel stronger, deeper, or more awake to your life and the world? So just consider that question for a moment. So I'm guessing, but I presume that a lot of you have had this kind of experience. Yeah, and some comments are coming in confirming that a lot of you have had this kind of experience. Anne says, key lesson, the vulnerability and the resilience of the human spirit. Yeah, that's right. And now support others who have lost their way. That's great. What we often find in these experiences is that there is a kind of resilience inside us that we weren't aware of. We become aware that we're much stronger and more resilient than we realized. But often it takes a challenge or a crisis to bring up our resources. They're often done, when our lives are stable and contented, we often don't have access to the full potential inside us, to our complete reserves of confidence, competence, and resilience, and so on. So often it takes challenges and crises to access and reveal the true capacities and potentials inside us. Max says, jumping out of a plane with a parachute. Yeah, that's I would count that as an experience of turmoil. I definitely wouldn't do that. In fact, the very thought of it would fill me with turmoil. But yeah, I can imagine the kind of relief afterwards and the sense of achievement. It would definitely be a kind of peak experience. So Philip says, divorce, Hemingway? The world breaks all of us, but many of us are stronger afterwards in the broken places. Yeah, very good. That's beautiful. You know the famous quote by Leonard Cohen? There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. And often it feels like that. It feels like the ego cracks due to turmoil, and somehow the light, an inner light, seems to come through the cracks of the ego. And sometimes when the ego breaks down, then a completely new self seems to arise inside us. Susan says, the bad experience itself doesn't do that. It follows from our response. That's true as well. Yeah, in fact, we're going to come to that in a short while. Because yeah, it's not just the experience itself. It's connected to the way that we respond to the experiences. So you've probably heard already in psychology of the concept of post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth is the idea that traumatic circumstances, traumatic situations, such as divorce, bereavement, failure, loss, and so on. Even accidents and emergencies. These intensely difficult situations can, in the long run, lead to personal growth. So around almost a half of the general population report being able to develop or grow in the aftermath of the trauma. Sometimes it takes a few years to come through, but in the long term, people begin to become more appreciative of their lives and of being alive itself. They develop more intense relationships, more authentic relationships. They develop the ability to be present, to enjoy the simple pleasures of life in the present moment, and so on. Those are some of the characteristics of post-traumatic growth. But in my research, I've looked into a phenomenon that I call post-traumatic transformation. And that's different from post-traumatic growth, because in post-traumatic transformation, there's usually a sudden and dramatic moment of transformation, a sudden dramatic shift when people suddenly shift into a different mode of being, almost as if a new identity arises inside them. It's almost as if their old identity breaks down in the midst of the turmoil and stress they're going through. And rather than that just being a breakdown, it's also a shift up, if you like, because a new self seems to emerge inside them. So I just want to explore this, the phenomenon of post-traumatic transformation in a bit more detail. This is the way that some people have reported it. It really is a sudden and abrupt, very abrupt shift in identity. So people often say that they feel like they're a different person in the same body, like they've been reborn in the same body. But one person said, it's like there are two people. There's a before and after. Another person said, the way it feels is that I've permanently broken through to another state. I've moved up to another level of awareness, which I know is going to stay with me. It's like a transformation a caterpillar goes through during the chrysalis stage before emerging as a butterfly. So that's a very beautiful, poetic way of describing the transformation. And I'm sure, that you, as you're listening to this, you're recognizing, perhaps you're recognizing some of these experiences from your own life. So feel free to share them if that's the case. And I'll just share a couple of examples from my research. So I found that this shift often occurs through facing death. Facing death is a very powerful situation. It's a very transformative situation. I sometimes talk about the spiritual potential of different situations, or the transformational potential. So there are certain situations or certain aspects of life which have a lot of transformational potential. And facing death is definitely one of them. A lot of people who face death, for example, through a diagnosis of cancer, obviously, it's a very devastating experience. It can produce a lot of anxiety and despair and sorrow. But it can also be, for some people at least, it can also be transformational in a positive way. And this is a woman called Irene Murray. And in 2000, she was diagnosed with cancer. And she was told that she probably only had a few months left to live because her cancer was quite advanced and quite aggressive. And she had a transformational experience right after she was diagnosed. And this is how she described it. She says, it was the first time I'd seen death as a reality and realized that life is just temporary. The following day, I woke up and thought, I'm just so lucky to be alive. The fact that I'm still here. The air was so clean and fresh, and everything I looked at seemed so vibrant and vivid. The trees were so green, and everything was so alive. I became aware of this energy radiating from the trees. I had a tremendous feeling of connectedness. So this was the next day after she was diagnosed. And it's a very good description of waking up to the preciousness of the gift of life it shows a really strong sense that before she had taken life for granted. But now that she was aware of death as a reality, suddenly she was no longer taking life for granted. And suddenly she was aware of the beauty of everything around her. Suddenly she had this amazingly intense vision. And believe it or not, this is not an uncommon response to being diagnosed with cancer. At least I'm aware of some similar experiences. There was actually a musician called Wilco Johnson. You may have heard about it about 5 years ago. He was diagnosed with cancer. And he had a very similar experience. It was just interesting because he was on BBC Breakfast, did a lot of radio interviews, talking about this really powerful awakening experience he'd had after being diagnosed with cancer. He talked about all his depression. He'd been a very depressive person. All his depression and anxiety suddenly dissolved away. And he was suddenly aware of this tremendous beauty and freshness of all the phenomena around him in the present moment. But sometimes when people have these experiences, they expect them to fade away. And sometimes they do fade away. Sometimes they're just awakening experiences. But sometimes they remain. Sometimes they become a stable experiential state. And this is what happened to Irene. It became her normal state. She said that feeling was really intense in the first few weeks, and it's remained ever since. It just blew me away. It really did. I used to just sit and think, this is amazing, that things could just fall into place so quickly. So the experience became less intense, but it remained as her normal state. And fortunately, her cancer went into remission. So, she actually died in 2013. After 13 years, her cancer finally returned. But she lived for 13 years in this kind of heightened state of awareness. And I spoke to her after her cancer returned in 2013. And she was obviously very sad, but also she was really grateful that she'd had the opportunity to spend 13 years in this kind of higher state of awareness. It had really transformed her life. I'll just give you one more example. This was a really interesting example I collected quite recently for a book I'm writing at the moment. And I found in my recent research that these experiences are not uncommon in the context of prison. There's actually quite a strong connection between being imprisoned, and awakening experiences or spirituality in general. I recently became aware of the really fantastic work of an organization called the Prison Phoenix Trust, based in the UK. And they run meditation and yoga classes in over 80 prisons in the UK. But they also support prisoners in their kind of spiritual development. They provide, support for prisoners who are going through spiritual awakening. And this is one of the examples I found when I was doing research about awakening experiences in the context of prison. This is a woman called Ananta. And in the 1990s, she was living a very kind of hedonistic life. She was taking drugs. And she was also involved with, she got involved kind of accidentally in, she came into possession of some drugs that she intended to sell to somebody else. And in Japan, she was arrested, and Japanese prison sentences are quite harsh, or they were at that time. So she was sent to prison. She was in prison for 3 years in very severe conditions. She was forced to work in a factory for most of the day, working incredibly hard. She didn't get any exercise, or she wasn't exposed to daylight, didn't have any amenities. And after months of this, she was totally broken down. She was so physically and emotionally drained that she felt as though she couldn't continue. She had to just suddenly give up. And she describes how one night she came back to herself in the factory after working, and she was in so much pain that she couldn't even read. And this is how she described it. One day I came back to the cell from the factory, and I was just about to start reading, and I couldn't. I was in too much pain. I lay back and kept dropping and dropping into the pain. It was excruciating, but I had to surrender to it. There was nothing else I could do. I dropped into a space where the physical body was no more. Whatever I dropped into just kept opening and opening into more and more light, beauty, into gratitude, freedom, freedom. There was only this beautiful love and bliss. And as with Irene, who we just heard from, this was a permanent shift for Ananta. She shifted into a permanent state of joy and wakefulness. And even though she was in prison for 2 more years, she was able to deal with the situation in prison much more easily because she was in a heightened state of awareness. And years later, once she'd understood what happened to her, and once she had integrated it into her life, she became a spiritual teacher. She is a spiritual teacher now because of this experience she had in prison. So yeah, it seems to be the point where, when people break down, when they are at rock bottom, like Ananta was, when they really can't continue and they surrender, then that seems to be a point where transformation is likely to occur. I'm actually just going to skip the next slide because, as usual, I'm running over time a little bit. But we'll send you the slides after the session so you can just have a look at that one. That's just about the connection between bereavement and post-traumatic transformation. Bereavement is also quite a significant trigger. So just before I move on, I want to ask you a question, actually. Is it possible to understand this transformation? Is it possible to explain it? Is there any reason? Can you think of any reason why people in intense turmoil are likely or possibly likely to this kind of transformation? Can you think of any possible psychological or spiritual processes which may be involved in this? Can you think of any explanations? If you can, share them in the chat box. Victoria says ego destroyed. Susan says the need for meaning. Philip says radical reorganization of boundaries, perspectives. Max says awareness of unused potential resilience. I think that is a factor. I think when the ego breaks down, then suddenly we have access to potentials and energies that we're not normally aware of. Dark night of the soul, wisdom of the desert. Yeah, I think definitely the dark night of the soul is connected to the phenomenon we're talking about here. A lot of Christian mystics talked about a period of desolation that they went through, a period of intense inner suffering, which preceded an awakening. Compensation. That's one possible explanation. Okay. Penelope says, I've suffered from bipolar episodes in the past, and I feel like I've experienced heightened awareness in both depression and mania out of illness. I can understand that. That's connected to what we're looking at today. Assagioli's psychosynthesis model might be able to accommodate this, the breaking down of the boundaries around the ego to allow contact with the higher self. Yeah, I think that's a good explanation. I think you're right that Assagioli's work is relevant here. He does talk about these issues. When you've got nothing to lose. Bob Dylan. Excellent. Like a Rolling Stone. Great song. Yeah, I think all of these things are relevant. Okay, so I'll just close down the chat box for a moment. And yeah, this is the way I explain. Obviously, there's no, cut and dried explanation for these experiences, but this is my interpretation. It's connected to ego dissolution. The normal sense of identity or ego or self, whatever you want to call it, definitely breaks down in these experiences. And, often it takes a long period of loss, turmoil, and suffering to break down the ego. One area when this can often occur is addiction. Addiction is psychologically quite an interesting process because gradually over a long period of addiction, people's identity breaks down. All of the things they depend on for their identity, such as status, roles, possessions, relationships, these things break down and they lead to a point of ego dissolution, which can sometimes be transformational. So I think ego dissolution can occur through intense stress, a bit like the way that a building collapses in an earthquake due to the intense stress. But it can also occur through, that's a mistake, it should be the dissolution of psychological attachments. The dissolution of psychological attachments can lead to ego dissolution because attachments constitute the ego or the normal identity. So by attachments, I'm talking about things like ambitions, beliefs, more tangible things like possessions, status, anything that we depend on, any external thing or construct that we depend on for our identity is a psychological attachment. And when these things break down, when we lose our ambitions and our hopes, when our beliefs are revealed to be illusions, when our hopes are believed to be illusions, when we lose our status, when we lose our roles in society, when we lose our possessions, but when all of these things break down, then the ego itself sometimes breaks down. And when the ego breaks down, there's sometimes, in some cases, what happens is that a new self seems to emerge, almost as if some people have a latent higher self inside them. When the normal ego breaks down, this latent higher self seems to emerge. It's almost as if it was always there, but somehow, because the normal ego self was in the way, filling up our inner space, this higher self could not emerge. So when the ego breaks down, in some people, a new latent higher self seems to emerge inside them. That's, the way I would interpret this experience too. But the big question is really, why does this happen to some people but not others? Because obviously, everybody goes through intense psychological turmoil at some point in their lives, but only a few people, comparatively few people, go through a transformational experience. So these are a couple of factors which I think are important. One is openness to experience. This is also true of post-traumatic growth. Research has shown that people who are more likely to undergo post-traumatic growth have a quality of openness to their experience. You could also say that they have labial ego boundaries. Some people have a very strong ego with strong boundaries. They have a strong sense of control over themselves and their lives. Some people have softer ego boundaries. People who are more creative, more intuitive, more spiritual, you could say. And these kind of people with softer ego boundaries seem to be more liable to have this experience. But also, there seems to be a quality of readiness. Some people seem to be ready for this experience, whereas others don't seem to be ready. When ego dissolution occurs, some people may just experience it as a breakdown because maybe there isn't yet a fully integrated higher self inside them, which is ready to emerge. In other people, it does seem to be ready, waiting to emerge. I can't see any reason why it should be ready in some people, but some people it just does seem to be ready to emerge, a bit like the way that a chick is ready to hatch from an egg. But this is probably one of the most important factors. It's acknowledgement and acceptance. So many of the shifters, as I call them, which are the people who undergo post-traumatic transformation, they could identify a point where they accepted their situation. And this was often the moment when transformation took place. A good example was a guy I interviewed who was an alcoholic, and he went through the AA process. And there's a point in the AA process where you hand over your problem because it's too big for you to deal with on your own. So this guy did that. He handed over his problem, he said mentally, you know, this is too big for me to deal with. Whatever you are, he wasn't sure whether he believed in God, but he could conceive of something bigger, something transcendent. So he said, you know, wherever you are, whatever it is, take away my problems because I can't deal with it. And at that moment, he experienced an inner shift because it was a moment of acceptance. It was a moment of surrender somehow. And another guy I interviewed was a gentleman called Michael Hutchison, who was an author. He was actually an author of books on spirituality, on spiritual technologies. And in the 1990s, when he was quite successful as an author, he had a terrible accident where he slipped when he was out running and fell over a bridge onto a rocky riverbed. And he became paraplegic. He broke his spine. And he was in a terrible state of suffering until about 2 years after his accident, in a state of intense suffering. He said that he heard a voice inside his head say, "What are you doing? Why are you resisting this? Just let go. Just accept it. Just let go." And he did that. He mentally let go. At that moment, he underwent a transformation, and he was never the same after that. He accepted his predicament and felt a sense of ease and acceptance. So I just want to look into acceptance for a moment. Just to kind of summarize what I'm talking about, these are the 3 stages of harnessing the transformational potential of adversity. The first one is acknowledgement, which means facing the reality of your predicament rather than mentally pushing it away, which a lot of people do. It's kind of natural. You know, we talk about fighting our predicaments, fighting against obstacles, pushing away situations that we don't like. It's kind of natural. It's kind of like the fight or flight mechanism. But in order to harness the transformational potential of adversity, we need to stop doing that. We need to, rather than pushing away our predicaments, we need to go towards them and acknowledge them. And once we've done that, we need to explore our reactions and feelings. We need to explore the turmoil we feel, the negative feelings that we feel. And we know from mindfulness that if you go towards feelings, if you explore feelings and observe them and accept them, then negative states seem to diminish. Pain seems to become less painful once we move towards it and become aware of it and explore it. And then we move into a mode of acceptance. We stop resisting the situation. We let go of resistance. And rather than resisting the situation, we embrace it, we accept it. And that harnesses the transformational potential of the situation. So I just want to practice this for a moment now. I want to do a little exercise for 5 or 10 minutes. And after that, we'll move into questions. So because acceptance is such an important quality in harnessing the transformational potential of adversity. And it's such an important quality anyway in our everyday lives. I want to just practice acceptance for a moment and cultivate acceptance. And this is it's a kind of meditative exercise, and I'll guide you through it. But I want to begin the exercise by reading a short poem or poetic piece. And as I read it, you know, just we can use this poem as a kind of meditative tool that will guide us into a relaxed state. And it will also illustrate the aims of the exercise. It will illustrate the transformational potential of acceptance. So this is my poem called The Alchemy of Acceptance. Emptiness can be a vacuum, cold and hostile, dark with danger. Or emptiness can be radiant space, glowing with soft stillness. And the only difference between them is acceptance. A task may seem tedious, a chore to rush through reluctantly, or a task may seem rewarding, a process to relish with an attentive mind that reveals more richness the more present you become. And the only difference between them is acceptance. Pain may seem unbearable, searing through you from a concentrated point, so that you have no choice but to resist, to try to escape, to push away the pain. Or pain can be a sensation that you can move towards and merge with, which no longer has a center, but dissipates through your being, until it becomes soft and numb, no longer pain at all. And the only difference between them is acceptance. Trauma can break you down to nothing, destroy the identity you spent your whole life building up, like an earthquake that leaves you in ruins. Or trauma can transform you, break open new depths and heights of your being, give rise to a greater structure and miraculous new self. And the only difference between them is acceptance. Life can be frustrating and full of obstacles, with desires for a different life disturbing your mind. Or life can be fulfilling, full of opportunities, with a constant flow of gratitude for the gifts you have. And the only difference between them is acceptance. So what I'm going to do now is take you through some different areas of your life where you may feel some resistance to certain aspects that I mentioned. And I want you to identify the areas of your life where you may feel some resistance, and where that resistance can cause some degree of turmoil, some degree of inner tension or conflict. And I'm going to take you through a process of releasing your resistance to those aspects. And hopefully you'll be able to experience some of the positive aspects of acceptance and harnessing some of the positive aspects of turmoil and tension. And it's always important to mention, though, that acceptance doesn't mean passive. It doesn't mean being passive. It doesn't mean you should accept every area of your life unconditionally, because there are some areas of our life where we need to change or improve. There are some difficult situations which we need to get out of or to solve. But acceptance, I think acceptance is the beginning of change. Once you accept a situation, you can begin to take positive action to rectify a difficult situation. So with that in mind, let me just guide you through a few different areas of your life where you may feel resistance. So the most kind of tangible area where you may feel resistance is physical issues, physical ailments that we're not happy about, that we may feel resistance towards. I have tinnitus in my left ear, and I've had it for 20 years. And when it first occurred, I found it very difficult to accept, and it caused a lot of tension and anxiety. Eventually, I learned to accept it. I learned to explore and acknowledge my tinnitus, to go towards it rather than try to move away from it. So eventually, I learned to accept it, and it became part of my normal experience. So it could be, for you, it could be something similar, some kind of physical ailment that you've had for a long time, which causes resistance and tension and conflict. Or it could be something more mundane in your everyday life. It could be something to do with the tasks that you have to do on a daily basis, maybe your job, household chores. Could be the situation you're living in. Could even be the lockdown, the lockdown that we've lived through, that could cause resistance. It's definitely caused a lot of resistance. But maybe there's a particular aspect of your everyday life that you resent in some way, that you find difficult to accept, some kind of job or responsibility in your life that you may feel resistance towards. Or it may be something connected to your life situation in general, in a more abstract sense. Maybe you're resisting your life situation in the sense of your career or your ambitions. Maybe you've not achieved your ambitions. Maybe, you're not happy with your relationships or the environment you live in. Maybe there's something about your life situation which you're not happy about and which causes resistance. So let's ponder over that for a moment. Or in a wider sense, there are certain aspects of life itself where we often feel resistance. For example, the aging process, the process of, if you're a man, the process of going bald, that can bring up some resistance and some tension. But just the aging process, the process of, the way our appearance changes as we get older, we may find that difficult to accept. Moving further away from childhood and youth and so on. But what about death itself? Death is probably the hardest thing for us to accept in our lives. We've seen already that facing death can be a transformational experience. But many of us feel some degree of anxiety, understandably, when we ponder over our own death. So, think about that. Do you feel resistance to the idea of your own mortality, to the reality and the inevitability of death? So what I'd like to do now is just pick one area where you feel some resistance, one area of your life which you find difficult to accept and which brings up some resistance and tension inside you. And we're going to work with that just for a moment. So first of all, I want you to just be aware, just acknowledge the situation and also the tension that this situation brings. Just be aware that the feeling and acknowledge the feeling and acknowledge the situation itself. And just explore it rather than moving away from the feeling. Just go into yourself and explore the sensation. Just move towards it. Just as if you're in pain, sometimes the best strategy is not to move away from the pain, but actually to move towards it. Once you move towards pain, it seems to diminish somehow. It's the same with any degree of psychological tension or turmoil. Once we move into it, it seems to diminish. So let's just do that. Let's just move into the tension or the resistance that we feel. And now, just close your eyes for a moment if you haven't already. And just be aware of yourself. Just be aware of your breathing for a moment. Just feel the air as it brushes your nose as you breathe in and as you breathe out. Just feel yourself relaxing a little bit with each breath, with each in-breath and out-breath. And just be aware of this situation where you feel resistance, and be aware of the feeling that this situation brings to you. Just gently observe it as if you're watching it from a distance. Just observe the feelings. And just be aware that your identity is rooted in the part of you which is observing rather than in the feeling. There's a space between you and the feeling. Just be aware of that space and just be aware of your own observing identity. And now I'm going to ask you to let go of your resistance, to release your resistance to this situation. just offload. Just imagine that you're offloading your resistance, as if you're cutting a cord or releasing a bond, letting go of a bond. And we can do that with our breath, just to make it more tangible. As we breathe in, we can take a long breath. And as we breathe out, we can let go with the out breath of our attachment to this situation. As you breathe out, just let go of your attachment. Just release your resistance to this situation. You can do that a couple of times, just take an in-breath, and then as you breathe out, just release your resistance to this situation. And as you do that, just make a mental shift into a mode of acceptance, where you accept this situation. And just imagine that you're embracing the situation. As you breathe out and you release your resistance, just embrace the situation. And embrace your life as it is. Just embrace the actuality of your whole life as it is right now, without any resistance. Let's just shift into a mode of acceptance. In which we embrace every aspect of our life as it is, and every aspect of the present moment that we're living in. Okay, and now we can bring this little exercise to a close, and we can open our eyes, slowly open our eyes again. So that's just a little exercise in turning resistance into acceptance. It's the alchemy of acceptance, as I call it. And we can practice that in any area of our lives where we feel resistance. We can acknowledge the situation, acknowledge the feelings that it brings up, and then go into ourselves and explore the feelings. And then just make a mental effort to let go of our resistance and to embrace the reality of our lives and of that particular situation. And as I said, I think that mode of acceptance is very significant in harnessing the transformational potential of adversity. Great, so if you have any questions, we've got a few minutes left to take some questions or any comments that you'd like to make. You can either write questions in the chat box or make comments in the chat box. I think there's also a box specifically for questions. We've got maybe five minutes or so left. Max says, what criteria can one use to decide whether to accept or resist? Well, it depends on how you define acceptance, but I think acceptance needs to be practiced in every area of our lives. I think once we practice acceptance in the sense of facing up to situations and acknowledging them and exploring them, then we know which aspects of our life need to be changed, or which we should just accept as they are right now. There's the famous Serenity Prayer from AA, which talks about, if I remember it correctly, it says, give me the strength to accept the things I cannot change the things I cannot accept, and the wisdom to know the difference between the two. So I think acceptance is a general quality which we practice everywhere, and we will then realize which aspects of our life we need to change. Oh yeah, a couple of questions from which emerged previously. What about awakening experiences after dreaming, especially lucid dreaming? Good question. Yeah, that sometimes happens. Awakening experiences can occasionally occur while we are asleep. And people may not remember much about them. I've heard cases of people only have a few memories of a powerful lucid dream, but they wake up in the morning feeling kind of euphoric and liberated. So yeah, awakening experiences do sometimes occur in dreaming. One thing I found recently, actually, in my research is that people who undergo transformation are more likely to lucidly dream. I'm not sure why, but there seems to be a connection there. Are awakening experiences similar to enlightenment? Yes, they are. But awakening experiences are temporary, whereas enlightenment is more similar to what I call post-traumatic transformation, the kind of state we've been talking about in the second half of the session. Like, I think, you could say that people like Irene and Ananta, whose experiences I discussed, I think you could say that they become enlightened to some degree, depending on how you define enlightenment, obviously. But I would say that they have become enlightened. Do you have a model of the psychological structures that are involved in awakening and how they connect? Do I have a model? Well, I've certainly written about it in my books, particularly in my book, The Leap. I've discussed in detail the psychological structures that are involved in awakening. I don't really have a model in terms of a figure or a diagram, but I certainly explain it in some detail. So yeah, I'd recommend checking out my book, The Leap. Have you published an article on the acknowledgement, exploration, acceptance process? Not specifically. I've written about it a little bit in my book, Out of the Darkness, which was a study of post-traumatic transformation. But I've begun to explore that more recently. And in fact, I'm writing a new book where I explore it in more detail. Thank you, Ho, for your comments. Can you please email me the Initiation Transpersonal Psychology poem for publication? Oh yeah, we'll do that. I'll do that. I'll do that, Ho. You mean the poem, The Alchemy of Acceptance? Madeline asks, is enlightenment more profound internal experience? Not quite sure what you mean there, Madeline. Could you explain that in more detail? Philip says, I seem to remember Eckhart Tolle and William Hoff both thought they might commit suicide and then had their transformation experiences. That's very interesting. Yeah, there is an interesting connection between contemplating suicide and transformation. I found that quite recently in research that I've encountered quite a few cases of people who intended to commit suicide, who actually attempted suicide and then underwent this transformation. I think in a strange way, it's related to acceptance, that when you intend to commit suicide, then you've given up. In a strange way, you've surrendered, you've let go of everything. So that state of letting go and giving up seems to harness the transformational power that we've been talking about. Okay, so I don't think there are any more questions. If there are any more questions, just quickly type them in now. Yeah, you'll have to maybe explain that in more detail, Madeline, because I'm not quite sure what you mean. If you're interested in finding out more, my website is here, stephenmtaylor.com. And if you are a member of the Transpersonal section, which I think most of you are, we're intending to have these sessions regularly, partly because this year, obviously because of the lockdown, we're not going to have a conference. So we're intending to hopefully have a session each month. Oh, got a couple more questions. I'll just quickly answer these questions. Oh yeah, just reading those comments. Thank you. The comments are going up very quickly. I haven't got time to read them. Do you think there is a difference between an awakening experience triggered by psychological turmoil and a spiritual emergency? Good question from Mike. Well, I think Assagioli wrote about this. Assagioli wrote about the turmoil that precedes a spiritual awakening and the turmoil which follows a spiritual awakening. So turmoil can precipitate and precede a spiritual awakening, but also the process of spiritual awakening itself can cause turmoil. So I think spiritual crisis or spiritual emergency usually refers to the turmoil that follows a spiritual awakening, that is created by a spiritual awakening. Obviously, they can overrun to some degree, But I'm mainly talking about the turmoil which precedes awakening. Yeah, I think there is a connection with the lockdown we're experiencing at the moment, the COVID situation around the world. In a sense, the whole world is going through a kind of crisis at the moment. We're all going through turmoil, and I hope that the turmoil we're going through collectively will have a positive effect. I hope we will undergo some degree of post-traumatic growth and some degree of post-traumatic transformation, hopefully. Okay. Yeah, Madeline mentions the Hong Kong problem. Yeah, there's a lot of turmoil in Hong Kong. So I'm sure the crisis in Hong Kong, the crisis throughout the whole world is, in some people anyway, having an awakening effect. Okay, everybody, thanks for, I've enjoyed reading your comments. Oh, one final point from Chris. Did you want to say something, Chris? I don't think you can speak, actually. You'll have to put your question or comment in the chat box. Or if if any of you have further questions, you can email me. If you just go to my website, there's a contact box. So, feel free to send me questions through my contact box if you weren't able to ask questions today. Okay, yeah, it's 5:15 now. So, yeah, thank you for sharing this session with me. Thank you for your comments and your questions. And I hope to see you at another section, another workshop from the Transpersonal Psychology section. Okay, everybody, thanks very much. We'll bring the session to a close then. All the best, and hopefully see you soon.